All right. Hello, hello. Welcome back. Today we're going to get into chapter 11, and we are talking about the war to end all wars, also known as World War One. There are a lot of key terms for this chapter. So you're just going to want to keep track of these key terms and make sure that you are taking notes on them as you go through the chapter. Our lecture questions for today are: what are the causes of World War One? How is World War One fought? And what are the important events that happened during World War One? So, at the dawn of World War One, European nations had essentially been experiencing a period of long peace. This really is a result of the wake of, the Napoleonic era and the 1815 Congress of Vienna. And with just a couple of exceptions, like the Austrian-Hungarian conflict with Prussia and the Franco-Prussian Wars, which were relatively short-lived, there was very little conflict all the way almost for an entire century. And because of this, Europeans got kind of lazy into believing that conflict would be small, would be localized, and would have little impact on civilian populations. So it's almost as if the historic memory of war had, in many cases and in many places in Europe, been erased. We're going to start to see things change, however, as we get to the end of the 19th century, with a Germany that is growing in power since its consolidation and its leadership under Otto von Bismarck, who is going to grow increasingly suspicious about his neighbors, France and Russia. And as a result of that, there is going to be an alliance that is going to be formed between Germany and Austria-Hungary. And later on, Italy will join, and that happens in 1862. And then later on, at the beginning of World War One, Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire will join what comes to be known as the Central Powers, but was originally the Triple Alliance. So the Triple Alliance, originally formed in 1862, was Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. At the start of World War One, Italy actually drops out of the alliance, and Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire will take its place. The important thing about this is that these alliance systems are pledging military allegiance. So essentially, if one country gets into a military conflict, those other countries have pledged already to get involved to back up the other country. In response to the formation of the Triple Alliance, the Triple Entente will be formed in 1894. This is what will become known during World War I as the Allies. Initially, it was just France and Russia, but also England will also join the Triple Entente. So as a result of this, right, you have Wilhelm II in Germany, who is going to become increasingly paranoid about the fact that there are all of these countries allied together around him. And because of that, we're going to start to see aggressive military buildup, both in Germany, but also in response to that in England as well. So when we talk about the causes of World War One, there is actually an acronym that we can use to help us remember the various points of the cause of World War One. And it's a 5-pointed acronym beginning with M. So if we start with M, we can see that M stands for militarism. And in this case, we're talking about military buildup. So we know that there are advances in machinery and weapons and things throughout the 19th century, and that even gets more intense as we get into the 20th century. So long-range artillery, submarines, eventually tanks, all of these things are being built and developed primarily in Germany and in England. The second part of the acronym is Alliance Systems, and we just talked about those alliance systems, right? So what happens is when there is a conflict that basically starts an event that starts the dominoes to fall at the beginning of World War One, you start to see these alliance systems activated. And when these alliance systems are activated, it is automatically going to escalate the conflict. So, unlike the other smaller wars that had happened during the 19th century with Prussia, between Austria-Hungary and Prussia and France and Prussia, those were pretty localized wars and other nations didn't get involved in them. That's not going to be the case when the event that leads to the start of World War I happens. So the second part of the acronym is an I, and the I stands for imperialism. And your textbook does a really good job of going into detail about a lot of these conflicts and competitions between Germany and their colonies, particularly in Africa, but also in Southeast Asia and other European countries like England and France. And so this is causing a lot of competition, both for resources in Africa and in Asia, and also access to markets in Africa and Asia. Okay, and the next letter in the acronym is N, and N stands for nationalism. So when we think of nationalism today, we're really accustomed to thinking about the idea of like patriotism, kind of feeling a sense of patriotic pride. And that's not necessarily true during the 19th century form of nationalism that we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is a nationalism that is relatively new. It's like this idea of a shared common history, ancestry, linguistics, culture, etc., that is starting to form a larger sort of nation state identity. And that has to do with a lot of different factors, but one of the biggest factors involved there is the expansion of communication and transportation networks. So whereas, when you go back into the 19th century before the advancements in transportation and communication, you're going to you see people that basically live in one area. They may only go within a 50-mile radius of where they were born, and there wasn't a lot of contact with the outside world. As we start to go into the 20th century, you're going to see those advancements in technology, communication, and transportation in particular, connect people on a much wider scale. And so people are starting to feel more connected with their nation and their national identity than with their regional identities. And this is important because obviously that is going to create conflicts that are going to be larger in size because people are going to all sort of have this same identification with the nation and what the nation wants. And the final letter in the acronym is significant people. The S stands for significant people. And here we are talking about the heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And it will be his assassination in June of 1914 that will start the series of events that will ultimately lead to World War I. Okay, so in addition to building up their armies and navies, military planners in several European countries also began designing how operations might occur in a next potential war. Germany, anticipating that they were encircled by our enemies, they anticipated that they would have to fight two fronts against Russia on one side and France on the other. So they developed a plan called the Schlieffen Plan. This was developed by Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen in the early 1900s. So they're anticipating this, well before, at least a decade before the actual outbreak of the war. The Schlieffen Plan held that Russia would be slow to mobilize because their military was very large. So Germany should use that time to attack Belgium and France and then pivot its army to fight Russia. This plan, they thought, would make the conflict a short one. They thought that they could easily cross through Belgium, get to Paris, occupy Paris, the capital of France, and then turn their attention to Russia. The French designed Plan 17, which called for major French offensive through Alsace-Lorraine, which is the territory right on the border between France and Germany. And this would attack the industrial heartland of Germany. So this, they thought, would essentially disable the German war machine. And then Russia developed Plan 19, which would order Russian attacks on East Prussia once Germany was engaged in France. So Russia would start with Prussia and try to disable the Prussian military, which was very powerful at the time. So now we're going to go turn to talking about the role of the Ottoman Empire in this conflict. So if you recall, the Ottoman Empire at its height had an empire that encompassed areas of the Middle East, North Africa, and significant territories within southeastern Europe. However, starting in the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire entered a period in which its power was really waning. And this was directly the result of not being able to respond to nationalistic challenges. So areas within their empire were starting to challenge Ottoman rule. In the 1820s, nationalist leaders in Greece began fighting the Greek Civil War, and in 1830, Greece gained its independence from the Ottomans. More countries will eventually split off from the empire in the 1870s, including Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria. And by the end of the 19th century, the demise of the Ottoman Empire, which was often referred to as the sick man of Europe, was being predicted. However, the timing was the only thing in question. The Ottomans were no longer strong enough to hold onto its outlying areas, and these grew even and ever more destabilized. Other powers in Europe watched with concern as the Ottoman Empire became weaker, and other countries stepped in to fill up this power vacuum, occupying and administrating a region but not annexing it, as the Ottomans would slowly withdraw. So here we are looking at a map of Europe prior to World War I. And I want to point some things out to you on this map. The first thing I want to point out is Germany. Germany right here. Sorry, it's hard to draw here. But Germany located right here, very large country, right? Huge, in fact, right? And then down below it, you see the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, okay? So two very large countries. Remember that they are in an alliance with each other. And then you have Italy here, which is technically part of the Triple Alliance, but will drop out of the alliance once the war starts. So we're not going to include them. But these two countries will remain allied during the war. In addition to that, Bulgaria will join and the Ottoman Empire will join. So you'll notice the Ottoman Empire here. Now, when we talk about the start of World War One, we need to talk about this southern part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Here, I'll put an X right here. Okay, and this is the area that is a real hotbed of resistance to the Austrian-Hungarians. They essentially want to be free from Austrian-Hungarian rule. And the country of Serbia, which is located down here as well, is wanting to help the southern people of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire become independent. Okay, so that's where the conflict is going to break out, that's going to start the war. So this map here shows us a blow up of the region that I was just talking about. And here we can see a couple of things. We can see Sarajevo, which is located right here on the map. And Sarajevo is where Franz Ferdinand is going to be assassinated. And then you see Serbia right here. Serbia at the time, an independent country, but still there is parts of southern Serbia that are part of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, and then you have this area right here, which is basically part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So what you start to see in this region of the world during this time period is the rise of pan-Slavic nationalism. And the Slavic people often shared linguistic ties, they shared religious and cultural ties, and they basically wanted to see a united pan-Slavic country, right? Believed that the Slavic people in the Balkans should be united. And this movement was really headquartered in Serbia. And they really opposed the Austrian-Hungarian rule in the area. They felt that the Slavic people should have the ability to rule themselves. Okay, and so the Balkan League is formed, and it's formed in order to help push forward the goals of having an independent Baltic state, and that leads to a couple of wars in the region known as the Balkan Wars. So this area, just as the Ottoman Empire becomes known as the sick man of Europe, this region of Europe becomes known as the powder keg of Europe, because this is where you're starting to see a lot of this nationalism turn into aggressive fighting in demand for independence. And these countries, these Balkan countries and these Slavic people are really crammed up against two big empires at the time, the Ottoman Empire and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And so they're feeling like they need to stand up for what they want, which is independence. And so this will lead, you guessed it, to the assassination of the Archduke. This happens on June 28th of 1914, and essentially the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife have traveled down to Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and they're traveling down there essentially as emissaries of the Austrian-Hungarian crown. Right. He's not, yet the king, but he is the heir to the throne. So he eventually will be king. And he's bringing a message, of peace. He wants basically to show that, the Austrian Hungarians are not, cruel rulers, that they care about the people in the Baltic regions, etc. Well, in the meantime, a Serbian terrorist group known as the Black Hand Gang had found out that the Archduke was going to be traveling to Sarajevo. and they essentially laid out the plans for his assassination. So, as his motorcade is driving through the city, there is a grenade that is thrown at the car. It misses and it rolls off to the side. It injures some bystanders, and the motorcade drives off, quickly to get out of the way. And then he goes and does whatever his obligation was for the day, and then decides that he is going to visit the hospital to give his well wishes to the people that were injured from the grenade assassination attempt. Well, this was sort of his fatal mistake, because his driver stops in front of a cafe where a man by the name of Gavril Princip is having a cup of coffee and stewing about the fact that the assassination attempt had not been successful the first time. And he looks up and he sees that the Archduke's motorcade has stopped in front of this cafe and apparently is in some kind of traffic and unable to move. And so Gavril Princip also happens to have a gun in his pocket. And so he walks out of the cafe and walks up to the car and shoots the Archduke and his wife, Sophia, thereby killing them right there very publicly. And this is what will set off the series of events that will eventually lead to World War I. How does it do this? Well, obviously, the Archduke's father, Joseph, is going to be very upset by the fact that his son has been killed, and he wants to punish Serbia, and he asks actually for Germany's help to do this. Germany agrees that they will help Austria-Hungary punish Serbia. However, Serbia then is going to be protected by Russia. Now, that relationship is a little bit more complicated, but you can think of it more like Serbia and the Balkan Slavic people are kind of like have a shared heritage with a lot of a lot of ties to Russia. So Russia wants to protect Serbia. And this is really where the conflict will culminate. And it goes back and forth. And it actually goes back and forth all summer long, until it will eventually be decided that, well, what will happen is Austria-Hungary will start attacking Serbia, which will then lead to Germany essentially being more aggressive and eventually invading Belgium and carrying out the Schlieffen Plan as they had planned, and this will then be the beginning of World War I. So that won't be until August of 1914. But when that happens, of course, it will escalate really quickly, and will lead to the First World War. So at first, of course, when the war breaks out, it's primarily just between the Triple Alliance, what becomes known as the Central Powers, and the Allied Powers, or the Triple Entente. But very quickly, this war will spread and become a global war. And this has to do with the fact that a lot of these countries in Europe, France, England, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, all of these countries, they all have colonies across the globe. And so if we look at this map, we can really see why this war was called a world war, because you see on the map all of the countries there in that gray color are part of the Allies. All of the countries in blue are part of the Central Powers, allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary. And then finally, you see the countries that choose to remain neutral during World War I. So if we look at the map, we clearly see that more countries are actually joining sides in this war than not. The majority of the world is either on the Allies or the Central Powers. So what we're going to see is, as I mentioned before, the Schlieffen Plan, which Germany had already planned to do at the event of an outbreak against the Triple Entente, an outbreak of conflict against the Entente. And remember, Germany's plan was to swoop into France via Belgium and essentially very quickly, kind of take over Paris and then turn their attention to Russia. Well, that didn't quite happen as they had planned. They do carry out the Schlieffen Plan, which does march their troops across Belgium into France. And then you're going to have this battle, the Battle of Marne, in September of 1914. And the thing is that the Germans never make it all the way to Paris in World War I. And in fact, the Allied forces are going to repel them and essentially push them back. And eventually, this is going to lead to this gigantic, long stalemate line that runs all the way down to Switzerland. It's hundreds of miles long. And this area is known in World War I as the Western Front. And the Western Front is essentially a series of trenches that have been built by both sides. And in these trenches, people are living, and that's where they keep their supplies. And every once in a while, they pop up from the trench and they run across, what comes to be known as no man's land and tries to take the enemy trench. This essentially leads to a 4-year stalemate where there's very little progress on either side. We're talking just miles at a time, back and forth, back and forth. And this causes obviously a very exhausting war environment, fighting environment, but also an environment that leads to a lot of sickness, and a lot of things like that. So very difficult fighting conditions on the Western Front in Europe during World War I. And this trench warfare that emerges is especially difficult for those that fight in it. And it requires, having, like I said, to live in the trenches for, 2 to 3 weeks on end. And then, going back to base camp, but then, going back out to the front lines. So very difficult fighting conditions. This is also where the American soldiers are going to fight in World War I as well, but the Americans do not get involved until 1917. So while on the Western Front of the war, you've got sort of this stalemate and this, entrenched trench warfare. On the Eastern Front of the war, where the Russians are fighting, you're going to have a much more fluid war. So not as much trench warfare, a lot of movement of troops, a lot of cavalry, things like that. So Russia had an army that was very, very large, but it did not have enough equipment because Russia was slow to industrialize compared to other European countries. And so, although they had a lot of manpower, they just really did not have the advancements in technology and equipment that other parts of Europe did. They did have a strategy, and their strategy, if you remember, was their Plan 19. And essentially, what they wanted to do was to attack Prussia, Prussia being this region of Germany up here. So they advance and carry out an attack at Tannenberg. And the Battle of Tannenberg really demonstrates the weakness of the Russian military. There were problems with communication, transportation, supply problems, all of this. And this will ultimately lead to a Russian defeat. And the Russians are going to have to retreat from Prussia. Because the fighting was so long and intensive and very mobile and moving, and again, because of problems with supply and supply lines, casualties in the eastern front of this war were very, very high. The British tried to help with a lot of the issues that the Russians were having in the east by imposing a naval blockade of German ports. So you'll notice here that Germany just has a very short coastline, and that leads to the North Sea. And it's from there that they relied on getting a lot of foodstuffs and supplies from other parts of the world, including the United States. And because the British were putting up a blockade, it becomes, over the course of the war, more difficult for the Germans to get the supplies they needed. However, the Germans are also going to have their submarines, and their submarines are going to fight against the blockade. So it's going to be a long process, and the British blockade really is not super effective, at least initially. However, it was an important tactic that leads to an important result in the long run. Okay, so this map is a really good one because it shows you a lot of stuff. It shows you the Western Front over here. So this line here, stopping at Switzerland, which remains neutral, and then this line here. So this is all Western Front. Again, we're talking about trench warfare. And then here is roughly the front line here. And over here, you get a lot of fighting between the Austrians and the Russians, the Ottomans and the Russians. You know, you get fighting along this line as well. And so you can see really that Germany and Austria and the Central Powers generally are really surrounded by the Allies. Here you can see when I was talking about the naval blockade, you can see here this is the coastline of Germany. And so you see here the British ships trying to block the North Sea, trying to block the English Channel, basically trying to stop anything from getting into German ports that might not only just help the war effort, but, you know, just resupply food and other stuffs like that. So this is a timeline that if you blow it up on your computer will kind of show you the timeline that ultimately leads to the outbreak of war. But I like this map because you can really see up close where the alliances are. You can also see the countries that are remaining neutral, which are not that many, but there are some. And little Switzerland there, always so neutral. All right, so colonies are going to play a major part in this role because all of these European countries have colonies around the world. And even if they are not colonies, so like, for example, Japan, they are really looking to strengthen their relationships and their alliances with European countries. So Japan, the Empire of Japan during World War I, will take an active role to attack German Chinese ports. So Germany had colonized and taken control of some Chinese ports in Asia, and the Japanese are going to attack just those ports, not the other foreign-held ports, but just the German ones. And again, this is in an effort to demonstrate to the Allies that Japan was aligning themselves with them. There were a lot of Chinese workers that were, you know, sort of either forced to or willingly align themselves with Britain and France. And in fact, over 100,000 Chinese workers are actually sent to Europe during World War I, and they will play an important role in mainly supporting the transportation networks, so the docks, the railroads, those types of things, supply lines, those types of roles is what the Chinese workers will play, but very significant and important roles in wartime. And then there were also some colonies that actually sent troops to fight in combat roles. So Indian troops, as you see here in this photograph, there were troops that were sent from Indochina, which is a French colony, and also troops from Africa. So, what was the role of the United States during World War I? Well, initially, the United States, at least outwardly and publicly, took a role of neutrality. They declared official neutrality, and part of this had to do with the fact that they still had very strong trading partnerships with both Allied powers and Central powers, and they didn't really want to give that up. But then the other thing was that there were a lot of German immigrants, Austrian immigrants, immigrants from that part of Europe in the United States. In fact, there were whole communities of German-speaking people in the United States, particularly in the northern Midwest. And at the time that World War I breaks out, German was actually the most common second language that Americans would learn. And so there was a lot of perceived cultural ties with Germany that seemed like very sensitive. And so the Wilson administration, Woodrow Wilson administration, and being the president at the time, he was sensitive to that and really thought of that as being problematic. There was also a lot of public pressure to stay out of this war. There was a lot of peace activists during World War I, a lot of public protests against the war during World War I. So, although they declared official neutrality, in reality, the trading partnerships and the supplies that were being sent to the Allies were definitely more, and in fact, they were even, it turns out, we were supplying the Allies with military help while still declaring official neutrality. So it was kind of problematic. And the Germans really weren't buying it after a while that the Americans were truly neutral. They knew that the Americans were actually secretly supplying the Allies with arms and things. But as far as the American public knew, at least at the time, the United States was taking an officially neutral stance. So one of the really interesting things about World War I is all of the new military technologies that are utilized during this war for the first time in warfare. And this was really important, but also turns out to be particularly devastating and shocking to a lot of people because although in theory they understood that there were these weapons, they didn't really understand the type and the scope of destruction that these weapons could cause in warfare. So I guess sort of while it looked good on paper, in reality, it wasn't that great. And so it's important to realize that. And in addition to that, there was also some old kind of warfare that was being utilized here as well, like, cavalry charges and things like that. So you're talking about, cavalry charges up against, long range artillery shells. It doesn't really work out too well, right? Especially, for the horse and the person on the horse. So Um, Here's a list of some of the new war technologies. I should mention the first one on the list is trench warfare. Not really a new technology necessarily. I mean, trench warfare had been used in the American Civil War, but the extent of the trenches, the elaborateness of the trenches that were in World War One, the way that the trenches were used, which was essentially as a military camp, so people slept in the trenches, I mean, everything happened in the trenches on the Western Front. So in that way, it was new. It was different. The scope was much broader. We also have the introduction in World War One of mustard gas, which is a poisonous gas that can be launched, through artillery into a trench and unleashed in a trench, and then it causes severe burning. Obviously, it can kill you if you breathe it in. It can blind you. In fact, Hitler during World War One was injured with a mustard gas attack at the very end of World War One. He was actually temporarily blinded. um, Machine guns were being used, particularly by the Germans during World War One, and they had the most advanced machine guns. So we're talking about rapid fire machine guns that could fire a lot of bullets all at once. They could put them on the edge of the trenches and just kind of fire across no man's land, and also kill people that might be trying to get across no man's land. And then you have the long range artillery guns, as I mentioned, flamethrowers that could, project fire, and that was used primarily to defoliate the area so that you could have clear sight lines of the enemy from your trench. But it could also be used just to, destroy the enemy as well. Planes and zeppelins, so zeppelins being big airships, and planes, in this case we're talking about biplanes, were used for the first time in warfare during World War One. This allows for reconnaissance, but it also can lead to destruction from the sky, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Tanks, and here you see a British tank, a small British tank. These were the original tanks of the day, now much bigger, but back in then in 1916 is when the British introduced the tanks and tank fighting to World War One. And then finally the submarines, and the Germans were really the ones that had perfected the technology for submarines. And that becomes a very important part, actually, of the war strategy for the Germans in World War One. So let's talk about submarine warfare now. So as I mentioned, it was the Germans that really perfected this design. They called them undersea boats or U-boats. And the original design was, essentially like about a 45-foot long vessel that could house about 30 to 35 sailors, about 12 torpedoes, but most significantly, it could stay underwater for 2 hours at a time, essentially making them completely invisible to the enemy. At the time, there's no sonar, right, to be able to pick up on submarines. And so the submarine was considered by the Allies actually as a coward's weapon because you couldn't see your enemy and they could sneak up on you. And they did sneak up on people. And they basically were initially just trying to attack the British boats that were carrying out the blockade of German coasts, but then they start to expand their reach and they start to attack passenger boats. And there was one U-boat in particular, U-boat 20, that had a captain that was extremely um, careless, I guess, in terms of civilian life, and would target civilian ships. And that's exactly what happened in May of 1915 when U-boat 20 sunk a passenger liner called the Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. This passenger liner was part of the White Star Line. This is part of the same big passenger ships as the Titanic. And when the Lusitania was hit with a torpedo, it only took 20 minutes for that huge ship to sink. When that happens, about 1,200 people are killed and drowned, and that includes 128 Americans. And the Germans claimed that the Lusitania was carrying weapons that the Americans were sending to the Allies. This actually turns out to be true later on when the documents are declassified, but at the time, the Americans denied it. And anyway, this is going to change the minds of some people in the United States about getting involved in the war. So the sinking of the Lusitania was a pivotal moment in some ways for the public opinion in the United States. However, it's still going to take another 2 years before the United States actually enters the war. Okay, so here we're going to look at some images, beginning with images of the trench warfare. And you can see here really how elaborate these trenches were. They were often reinforced, with wood or um, concrete or whatever they needed in order to make it more comfortable to be in the trenches. Sometimes the trenches were not reinforced and they would become very muddy at the bottom, and people would get something called trench foot, which is essentially where your boots and your socks and your feet get wet and they never get dry. And because your feet is constantly wet, your skin eventually starts to rot, and it's very, very uncomfortable. And so these were very intense places to be in. And again, soldiers would be sent out to the trenches for weeks at a time. And if your commanding officer told you to go up and over the edge of the trench out into no man's land, then you had a real possibility of being killed. So if we look at this artist rendering of the trenches, this is no man's land here, right? This big space between the two opposing sides and their trenches. And this would often be, scarred with artillery, pock holes from artillery shells exploding, lots of barbed wire, ramparts, all types of things that were basically, obstacles for the enemy. So it was a very intense place to fight. And again, you're talking about stalemate. So, you're not really making a whole lot of ground one way or another. So I also mentioned biplanes, and biplanes were the only planes that were used during World War I. We didn't have jet planes yet. And so the biplanes were used for reconnaissance. So people would go up and, sort of spy on the enemy. But the other thing that they were used for was for fighting. The two planes would fight each other. So on the top photo, you see the Royal Air Force, the RAF, as it's often referred to, that has the circle on its wing. And then on the bottom here, you see Luftwaffe, and that's the German Air Force, essentially. And both of them had designs with machine guns on the front. And so these machine guns would be used to shoot down an enemy plane. So you had these things in the air called dogfights, where the two sides would fight each other and try to shoot each other down out of the air. So very dramatic plane warfare at the time. Yep. And then, as I mentioned, the machine gun, right? And the Germans had the Maxim machine gun, and you can see here it was a very large gun. It required a stand basically to help a human hold it up, and it could fire, massive rounds of bullets, and was very, very deadly, particularly for anybody that was trying to go up and over and across no man's land. For a very brief time at the beginning of World War One, the Germans also used the Zeppelin airship, and you can see a picture of it here. So the airship, essentially a blimp, right, flies very, very slow, is big. But there was a couple times at the beginning of the war where airships were sent across the English Channel and actually dropped some bombs on English cities. And because of this, obviously, the British military was very concerned, and so they had to invent a special bullet that could penetrate the skin of the airship. And once they invented the bullet, then the Germans stopped sending the Zeppelins over, simply because obviously they're going to get shot down because they move very, very slow and they're big. But one of the things that was pretty striking about this at the time was the fact that the Germans were willing to target civilian populations, which was not extremely common in warfare up until this time. And so you're starting to see that become more of a thing in World War One, which is a disturbing trend considering the fact that the weapons are much more deadly. So it's very important to understand that up until World War One, we really did not see military conflict on this scale with the type of destruction that was possible with these new military technologies. What was also interesting about this war was the scale on it in terms of a human cost, right? So this comes to be known, this type of warfare becomes to be known as total war. And this is a war that is fought using all available resources. So whether that be technological or human power, whatever, with absolutely no restrictions on the types of weapons that are used or the targets that those weapons are going to be pointed at. So people that were in the countries that were experiencing this war firsthand were asked essentially to make personal sacrifices to contribute to the war effort, right? Women in particular were asked to play a huge part on an unprecedented scale. And women were asked to, not only obviously hold down the home, but also get involved in the war effort themselves. So many of them went into factories to work in the factories. Many of them grew gardens at home, so they didn't have to take the um, the the vegetables from the stores, that the stores could then, that the agricultural industry could then give the vegetables to the soldiers. Many people were asked to stop eating meat on certain days of the week, like meatless Mondays, that kind of thing. So huge amount of personal sacrifice in order to keep the war machine going. And this was also very much displayed in the propaganda of the time. Lots of posters, lots of different posters trying to get people to not just support the war, but also to be involved with the war, to essentially promote this idea that everybody needs to do their part. So it was the type of war that really hit everybody, right? It's not just the type of war that is being played out on the battlefields in some remote region. It's everybody is expected to be part of this war effort. That is what total war is. So one of the little known facets of World War One is a horrific event known as the Armenian Genocide. And this was something that was carried out sort of on the fringes of the World War One, on the Eastern Front, in the Ottoman Empire, along the border of the Ottoman Empire and Russia. So this was really an example of extreme prejudice, which affected the Armenian people within the Ottoman Empire. So, Armenians were a Christian minority that resided in both Ottoman and lands and in Russia. And due to their background, their religion, location, right there on the border, they were seen as potential collaborators with Russia, who were also Christian because the Armenians are Christian. So, believing that the local Armenians had been working against the Ottoman army, in 1915, Ottoman troops began systematically murdering them. The Armenians defended themselves, and the Ottoman government ordered their removal from the region completely, granting its officials permission to repress any type of resistance. So, over the next few months, approximately 1 million Armenians are going to die from forced marches. So, they're forcing them into exile, or they were executed typically by firing squad by the Ottoman government. The Ottomans, after the war, did not acknowledge the genocide, and to this day, the Turkish government refuses to admit that it occurred. But there is obviously widespread evidence that it did occur, and it was one of those things that happened during wartime that just kind of slipped through the cracks, but is still very much an important part of the history for Armenians to this day. So another thing that's happening during World War One is there's a lot of backroom deals going on. And as I mentioned when I talked about the causes of World War One, one of the primary causes is imperialism, which is essentially competition for markets, resources, etc., between European countries. And particularly France and England really wanted to ensure that they had a lot of power in areas that would be impacted by the outcome of World War One. So in 1916, there's a secret agreement that is made called the Sykes-Picot Agreement between France and England. The Italians were also aware of it, as were the Russians. And essentially, what France and England did here was they agreed that they were going to divide up the Middle East into spheres of influence amongst themselves. And France would get Syria and Lebanon, and England would get Jordan, Iraq, and Palestine. And you have to understand, and we've talked about the Middle East throughout this course, this is an area of the world that really did not have a lot of European influence. There was a lot of Islamic empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Safavid Empire, lots of different empires, most of them Islamic, had influence in this region, but Europeans no. And so this is really the beginning of a huge cultural shift in the Middle East, a political instability and shift in the Middle East, and also an economic change in the Middle East. And so it's very important to realize that a lot of what we see in terms of instability, politically, religiously, all of these things, you're going to start to see that really increase after World War One. Okay, so we're now going to talk about the Russian Revolution, which of course is this gigantic topic that could be a course in and of itself, but we're going to talk about it today within the context of World War One. So Russia was big and large, but also a little bit behind the times, right? They still were ruled by a very powerful monarchy, the czars, and there was a lot of political discontent within Russia. And there was a lot of anger at World War One because it was bringing a lot of suffering to the Russian people. And so you start to see the rise of these various political opposition parties to the Tsarist rule. And the first are the Mensheviks, who are going to challenge the Tsarist rule in February of 1917. And there'll be these massive strikes on the city of Petrograd. And the Petrograd Soviet, which is like a political body, was formed under the leadership of Alexander Kerensky. And this revolution is essentially going to oust the czars from their positions of political power. But there was another group known as the Bolsheviks in Russia that wanted to see it taken even a little bit farther. And they had a slogan called uh, uh, titled Peace, Land, and Bread. And essentially what that meant was peace, meaning remove Russia from World War One, land, meaning redistribute the land so that peasants can, have some land. And then bread obviously means, food for the people. And the leader of this movement was Vladimir Lenin. And Lenin had been in exile. He had, sort of um, left the country, because he was considered a political enemy of the state. And he saw the revolution in February of 1917 as an opportunity to get back into Russia and lead his Bolshevik revolution. And that's exactly what he did. The slogan Peace, Land, and Bread was so popular by the people that the Bolsheviks are actually able to then take over the revolution. And they carry out their promise to remove the Russia from World War One in the Brest-Litovsk Treaty of March of 1918. This is a treaty that Russia makes with Germany that essentially removes Russia, takes Russia officially out of World War One. This is important, obviously, for Russian history. This is a huge turning point for Russian history. It will be the beginning in Russia of a civil war. It will be the beginning in Russia of a communist style government. But for the war effort at the time, this is really devastating to the Allies because they are losing this huge ally that they have in the East. And this now is going to allow for the Germans to really focus all of their attention on the Western Front. So that's going to put even more pressure on the Allies. So as the Allies are experiencing more pressure is also going to be put on the United States to get involved in this war effort on the side of the Allies. And you start to see some things happen beginning in 1916 that are really going to lead to the United States entering this war. The first is the Battle of the Somme, which was a huge battle in British military history. It's legendary because there were huge amounts of British casualties in this battle, tens of thousands in a day. And it was a very long-lasting battle fought on the Western Front from July to November of 1916. And it was considered a huge military blow to the British. The second is that after the sinking of the Lusitania, the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson had basically given the Germans an ultimatum, telling them that if they continued to carry out unrestricted German warfare against American ships, or at least ships that have Americans on them, that the United States would get involved in the war on the side of the Allies. And the Germans actually ceased their unrestricted warfare for a brief period of time, a little over a year. In the fall of 1916, they will resume their unrestricted warfare, mostly targeting U.S. military vessels in the North Atlantic. And then there was the Zimmermann telegram, and the Zimmermann telegram is probably the most famous and most notorious reason why the United States gets involved in World War I. So the Zimmermann telegram was a top secret telegram that was sent from Germany to Mexico. Mexico at the time is a neutral country in World War I. Okay, and the Germans send this telegram. It's intercepted by British intelligence officials, and the British decode the telegram, and they come to realize that essentially what the Germans are asking is that the Mexicans get involved in World War I against the United States, with a possible, land invasion of the United States. And they say in the telegram, in exchange for you helping us with this war effort, we will ensure that you get back your northern provinces that you lost as a result of the Mexican-American War. So this, of course, would be California, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, Colorado. And obviously the British officials see this, they go, haha, this is, exactly what we need to try to get the United States involved in this war. They show it to Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, and obviously this is clear to him now, that the Germans are willing to do anything possible to undermine the safety of the United States. And so there starts to be more and more talk of war against Germany. And then finally, there was the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II in Russia, beginning with the February Revolution of 1917. This eventually then leading to the October Revolution of 1917, taking then Russia out of World War I, thereby putting more pressure on the Allies in the Western Front. And so finally, Wilson will ask the United States Congress for a declaration of war against Germany in April of 1917, and he gets it, and we, meaning the United States, will enter World War I. So when the American Expeditionary Force is formed to go and fight in Europe, the American soldiers are very unprepared, and it takes them quite some time to get trained and to really be prepared to fight in combat positions. And so what you're going to see is that for the most part, with some exceptions, Americans are really not going to be mobilized for battle until we get into the summer of 1918. And so the biggest battle that the U.S. troops are involved in is the Battle of Meuse-Argonne, also known as the Battle of the Argonne Forest, and this is a massive Allied offensive against the Germans that's carried out between September of 1918 and November of 1918. There is a massive mobilization, as I mentioned, and the U.S. troops are going to be able to successfully push back the Germans for several miles along the Western Front, which, considering the fact that it's just a matter of miles in each direction, that was a pretty huge accomplishment. But the Germans were dealing with a whole lot of other problems by the time we get to 1918. There is a widespread civil unrest within Germany itself. There is a naval mutiny that's taking place, and there is a forced abdication of the German Kaiser Wilhelm II. He's essentially forced to abdicate. And in addition to that, there is a massive influenza pandemic that is ravaging the trenches of the Western Front. And you're getting tens of thousands of soldiers that are actually dying from this influenza, because this particular pandemic really targeted younger people between the ages of 20 and 40. And so because of all of this, and in addition to that, the fact that the United States President Woodrow Wilson had introduced a series of peace provisions known as the 14 points, that the Germans really hoped would be incorporated into any kind of peace treaty. So because of the 14 points and because of all of this unrest, the Germans actually agree to an armistice in November of 1918. So the armistice that was negotiated essentially just called for a ceasefire, right? That's what an armistice is. And because Germany was facing all of these internal problems, they really hoped that the war could end. Wilson's 14 points would be, like I said, incorporated into some type of peace treaty. So with all of these things in mind, they decide and they agree to stop fighting on November 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. So this is, a huge, obviously, move towards peace. And this is a huge relief to those that had been fighting for years in this war. And again, it brought a lot of hope to people around the globe that there would be some type of treaty that would be negotiated that would lead to lasting peace. The end result of World War I was absolutely devastating. People had never really experienced warfare on this scale before and destruction on this scale before. So you're talking about, 8.5 million soldiers dead, 20 million wounded, countless more wounded, if not physically, mentally with PTSD, which they called back then shell shock. And 1 million civilians are going to die in this conflict, which again was huge for that time period, right? In a time when wars were typically fought on the battlefields and not with targeted civilian populations. So the end of World War takes place. It happens in the form of an armistice that the Germans agree upon. And it still needs a treaty, right? It still needs some type of negotiated peace. And so that is what we will be talking about next week. We will be talking about the Treaty of Versailles. So that is all. Have a good day. Bye.